So when they said that I was going to do one of my talks on Thursday morning, the last day of the conference, I expected maybe 15 people to show up, in all honesty. So I'm blown away that there's actually people standing in the back because the room's basically full. So thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Impressed that everybody's up this early on the last day. Anybody at the Wynn Hotel party last night? I'm curious. All right, cool. All right. I noticed that there aren't many people. They're probably all still sleeping. So, all right. My name is Scott Jameson. I work for a company called Dronata, and what I'm going to do is go through some records management information this morning. I'm not really going to go into e-discovery, which is a related but different topic. I'm going to mainly stick with managing the records themselves and content, and in the context of ECM in general, right, and how 2010 differs from 2013, et cetera. So, anybody in my Monday session? I'm curious. All right, a handful of people. So, those of you who are in my Monday session remember Bob, and I'm going to basically tell a story about Bob. And the story of Bob goes that Bob is a little bit sad today. And the reason Bob is sad is that, well, first he installed SharePoint. Anybody here a SharePoint? All right, let's hear it for SharePoint, yeah. So he deployed SharePoint. He felt like a superhero because, you know, deploying SharePoint sometimes you got to be a superhero, right? And things were really good. At least Bob thought so. But then he got a request, right? And he was a little worried. He got a request that said, hey, we need to have some kind of records management thing going on in our organization. And he wasn't really sure what that meant because he's the guy in charge of managing SharePoint. He's not a records management expert, right? He got a lot of folks to please. He's got people from legal coming, compliance, right? He's got end users that are using SharePoint now, and they're saying, whoa, don't make it overly governed or hard or complex because I have to be the one using the thing every day, right? So Bob went to the SharePoint conference, and he learned all about SharePoint 2013, and he said, wow, this has got to be the solution, right? Well, maybe it's the solution, not sure. So he's not really sure how to proceed, so what he's going to do is he's going to come to our session, and we're going to help Bob. We're going to help Bob navigate, at least to some degree, what the records management waters look like in the context of SharePoint. Yeah, that's me. You like that? It looks just like me, doesn't it? No, that's us. That's collectively our assistance for Bob. How's that? It's like a metaphor. It's symbolic. We're going to reach out and give him love, basically. Everybody needs love on the last day of the SharePoint conference. All right, so I work for a company called Dronata. Dronata is a solutions provider, Microsoft partner out of Boston. I am a SharePoint MVP and have a couple of books out, SharePoint 2007, 2010, and the upcoming 2013. I will give a copy of both 2010 and 2013 out today for some lucky winner. And I'm also what's known as an MCM and an MCA, which I believe Jared mentioned on the first day of the conference. So I've been doing SharePoint for about maybe 13 years, since before 2001 version actually existed, which is pretty cool. All right, so 4 things I want to cover today. Basically, I want to talk about enterprise content management in general, right, of which records management is a piece. And the funny thing is, when I talk to a lot of our clients, their records management needs actually vary, and what they describe as wanting records management actually varies as well. Because even though records management has a specific definition, folks actually use it sometimes in a broader context of just enterprise content management in general. So I want to talk about both of those. I also want to talk about what's new in SharePoint 2013 for records management, which here's the secret. It's not that much, frankly, but I'll talk about it. And then I'm going to go through the top 10 list, which I don't know why I like doing top 10 lists, but it's fun. And I'm going to go through the top 10, what I consider is some of the best practices around approaching records management in the context of SharePoint. All right, so enterprise content management. What is it? Well, from a SharePoint perspective, there's sort of these tenets around what SharePoint allows you to do in the context of document management and content management in general. Things like sharing information. That's why it's called SharePoint, right? You want to share information, mainly documents. But you also want to do things like organize that content well, right? Don't just leave it as a trash heap on the G drive or whatever it is, or the X drive. You want to discover information. So this is search, e-discovery, things like that. You want to build documents and build a nice collection of information. Then you want to manage those properly. So if we look at sort of three sort of steps that are typically happening in an organization, there's creation of documents. This is the most popular thing that happens, right, within an organization. People love creating documents. Maybe they don't love creating them, but they do lots of that, right? Creating documents is really the idea of, you want to create them, but you also want to have some facility to organize them. On a file share, it's mainly what? Folders. Same with your hard drive. And then when we're looking at SharePoint, there's other ways we can do that through metadata and other things like that, right? Columns, etc. But as an organization goes from, an individual just creating documents themselves, they want to start sharing them with the team, you want to have some control. So you want to actually have some kind of content policy potentially. You want to have some information architecture in place and some kind of taxonomy that's standard. And the reason is, if you don't make some of these things standard, then the new person who's trying to find it later, who's a different person from the content creator, has to, think about what was in the person's brain when they organized this folder structure or document library or whatever it is, right? So if you have some consistency, then you have a much better chance of other people finding that information later and using it effectively. And using that information to then either route or dispose of or whatever the action that you need to do on those documents. And then finally, sort of at the other end of the spectrum, which is almost everyone has a need to create documents. Probably most, right, have the need to control them in some way. Maybe it's just some subset of the documents. And then there's another subset, which is, how do I protect these from a risk and compliance perspective? And that's really where records management comes into play. So if you think about who does this and when, right, creating documents without the other two, without any control and without any protection is really almost like a personal thing. On my hard drive, I don't really care that they're organized in any way that my team cares about, right? I just care that I can find it later. But once you start working with other people on a team, let's say, you want to start thinking about, how do I put policies and practices in place that make it easy? And then my entire organization probably has even greater needs around protection and discovery and retention and all those things later. All right, so if we look at those, the nice thing is ECM as a concept, right, enterprise content management, has evolved to the point where creation and organization is actually pretty intuitive and simple. Unfortunately, most users are still stuck in the, here's my dumping ground and here's my folders, and that's all I care about. Right? And there's a lot of resistance to doing anything that feels harder than that. And I want to try to help you overcome some of those barriers. We want to also ensure that compliance is achieved through that policy. So step one is, how do you train users to do the most basic things, like fill out one or two little properties, let's say, and I have some tricks to do that. But then the next step is, how do we as an organization, or at least as a team or a department, become consistent? And then how do we as an organization to make sure we have things like compliance taken care of? All right, so from an enterprise content management perspective, we basically have those three areas of what we need to address. From a records management perspective, what do we mean when we say records management? Really, at the end of the day, it's a practice or a discipline of identifying, classifying, archiving, preserving, and destroying records. So the idea is that you define, what am I doing with this document? What am I doing with this piece of information? And a record doesn't have to be a document, right? It's probably the most popular kind, but a record could be anything. It could be a training video. It could be someone's, tax form that they fill out, or their job application. I guess those are documents too, technically. It could be a web page, right, in your organization. It could be lots of different things. And you want to do them according to predefined standards. So the idea is that it's not just that we destroy stuff over time, it's that we do it in a controlled, repeatable manner. And that's the part we want to get to, is the controlled, repeatable manner part. All right, records management. Why do we need to do this? Well, the main reason is that organizations are facing increasing pressure to manage risk. Really, at the end of the day, anything you have to do versus things you want to do in an organization mainly revolve around risk, right? Has anybody heard of the word governance? Yeah, exactly. So the reason SharePoint governance needs to happen, right, or you need to have an approach to it and a strategy within your organization, is that really the only thing your governance policy should try to address in my opinion, is risk. And the reason is anything else is really guidance for users or nice training, right? Everything leading up to, you have to do this really isn't governance, but the things that people have to do, or we will fire them because it's really bad for the organization and introduces risk, is outside of that. So why do we have to do this? Well, the reason we're managing risk is through more compliance laws and things like that. So there's things like the U.S. Sarbanes-Oxley Act. There's the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. These are U.S. examples. And the idea is that because of certain industries like the healthcare industry, financial services industry, some of these regulated industries, there's a greater demand for making sure you're keeping track of your information properly in the form of records management. So what are some of the problems we have with records management? Well, one of the problems we have is applying retention to policies to content. So how do we know how long we're supposed to keep this stuff? And what's interesting is when I talk to organizations, they're sort of getting there now. Like they're on the edge of, hey, we need to start thinking about something simple like retention policy, because we've been told we need one as an organization. So how do we come up with that? Now, it's important to remember that legal and compliance, they should come up with what your policies are as an organization, and then it's our job to implement those policies within SharePoint, right? High cost of complying with new laws, so we don't want to make it burdensome or overly costly to comply with these things. And one of the problems is we can't put too much burden on humans, but at the end of the day, they are still ultimately responsible for making sure they're complying with things, right? So there's a combination there of having the rules and then making sure people follow them, but then also making sure our implementation inside of SharePoint is as easy and sort of magic as possible. And it is possible to do some of that. Access to controlled records. So this is another question. So do we do records management in place, or do we do it in a records center, for example? And there's actually trade-offs that I'll go through in a little bit, where if I move a record to another location, right, even if it's still within SharePoint, the access and control might be different there. So if I'm a collaborator and I still need to access a record frequently, that might pose a challenge if it's in a different location. But if I'm a records manager, I might have an issue if everything's done in place, because now everything's spread out over many, many sites or document libraries or whatever. Heavy reliance on IT. IT does not own the records management strategy, or should not own, right? That should, again, be owned by legal compliance, et cetera, but IT has to implement that. And then finally, poor adoption. And what happens is, if you make it simple and you make it targeted at a specific group and give them training and they buy in, adoption isn't so bad. But the tricky part is that if you have lots and lots of people, potentially hundreds or thousands of people, creating documents that need to become records later at some point in time, you want to make sure along the life cycle of the document that things are being managed pretty well, so that the records manager isn't handed a heap of steaming crap, right, at the end of the day. That's a technical term, by the way. Okay, so what should your strategy or approach to records management be? You want to view retention and just records management in general as a component of the overall document lifecycle. Because if you do that, what you start doing is you start getting a little bit of discipline in the organization, and it makes it so much easier to not only do records management later, but to also have a greater, more easily findable set of content for regular users. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. So what does a content lifecycle look like? Well, typically there's many potential steps. I don't want to say absolute steps, but there's many steps. So the create step is, I'm a user, I create a document, let's say, hypothetically. Again, I'm in that number one of the three general areas. I'm doing this myself. It doesn't really matter if I'm managing it well, because I'm creating a document, and I'm going to use it later, and nobody else cares about it, right? But then if I start getting into the team thing where I'm starting to share it and work with other people, now I'm getting into collaborating on that document. Maybe there's a review process and an approval process. So I want to make sure that is reasonably well defined so that other people get what I'm doing, right? And then later, if someone leaves the company or something like that, someone else could pick up where they left off, no problem. And then there's the last step in the cycle where maybe I'm declaring this as a record, or maybe I'm publishing a document, which are different things, but they're similar in that I'm making it more official and more corporate at that point. Right, and I have to define that within my organization. What is publishing a document mean versus declaring it as a record? And there is a definite distinction, which is publish usually means I just want to share it with a broader community, and it's sort of an internally official piece of information. but a record is something we need to lock down and probably retain over time, right, as an official company record. And then we have expiration and archival or destroy. So when it expires, what happens to it, right? And we want to define that stuff. So how do we approach that? Before I go into how we approach that with the best practices list, let me go into SharePoint 2013. Everybody knows that there's this new product out this week, yeah? SharePoint 2013? If you haven't heard of it, probably look into it. What I'm going to do is go into a little bit what's new, all right? Before I go into what's new with 2013, let's sort of turn on the Wayback Machine for about 3 years ago and say, well, what was introduced in 2010? Content organizer. So this is where I can route documents based on metadata into different buckets within a library, for example, which helps me partition information properly. Document sets, which is the ability to take multiple documents and treat them as one, right? It's essentially a folder with special magical properties that I can actually manipulate, for example, all the properties within the documents for all the documents in the Record Center at once, and then put the whole set of documents through a workflow, for example. I can even treat the whole document set as a record if I want. Document IDs, which uniquely identify documents. How many people use location-based metadata defaults? All right, so these are my disciples. So, because I'm a big fan of this feature, and I'll tell you why. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about when I say this? Okay, so I will demo what this is, but it's probably, I think, SharePoint's most underrated feature, and I think it's super useful, especially when users want to do things like drag and drop and are too lazy or spiteful or something to fill in metadata, for example. Wow, you guys must have users like that. This guy's like, no, I am one of those users. Right? So I will talk about what location-based metadata defaults are in a minute. They are actually something that was introduced in SharePoint 2010. All of this stuff that I'm talking about is carried forward in 2013 as well. Metadata navigation. So this is if I actually have good metadata information on my documents, that I can use that in navigation, which is really handy as well. In-place records. So in SharePoint 2007, Microsoft introduced a site template called a record center. And the idea was you put all your records into that place, and then you treat them differently, maybe with some different permissions and things like that. And essentially what it did is it was sort of a lightweight or quick and dirty way to segment out your records that you wanted to declare to keep them separate from in-process collaborative content, right? And the idea was I could do things like, maybe put some kind of workflow process or lock down, the information or whatever. And it didn't necessarily fulfill all the records management requirements that everybody wanted, but it was a good start if you weren't doing any kind of records management at all, right? With 2010, Microsoft introduced in-place records, which means I could be inside a document library that's an active site. Let's say it's a project I'm working on, and I could declare a record in place. The nice thing about that is that as a user, I could just say, you know what, I don't have to move a copy of it somewhere else and get confused about, which version is where, things like that. And then there's site-based e-discovery and hold. So this is the legal hold side of it, which is in 2010, this was site-based, so you'd have to do it on a site collection by site collection basis. So in SharePoint 2013, a couple new features, not that many, just so you know. Site retention. So instead of just retaining a single document, in 2010 you could put retention policies on either folders, libraries, or content types. So I could say, I want all contracts from when they were created, hold on to those for 7 years, or for when they were declared a record, hold on for those, to those for 7 years, let's say. In 2013, I could do that with an entire site. And what I mean by that is I can say, hey, we just finished this project, right? Let's keep this project site around, but mark it read-only. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. Site mailboxes. The reason this is important is that you can actually have an Exchange mailbox with basically the same name as my team site, for example, or project site, or whatever it is, in SharePoint. And SharePoint and Exchange will talk to each other and keep those things synced up. And actually, when I dispose of or delete or archive or whatever my SharePoint site, the mailbox in Exchange will actually follow and actually get closed down at the same time my site gets closed down. So that works in combination with the site retention feature. The third thing, which isn't really a feature per se, is we have cloud parity now, which means that all the stuff that was in SharePoint 2010, for example, but wasn't in Office 365, like a record center, is now, with the release of the current Office 365, which is the 2013 version, that's what I'll be demoing, actually has all the stuff that you want, like a record center and retention and in-place records management and holds and all those things, right? All right, so the product team basically had two key goals, which is do this investment in cloud first, right? If you were at the keynote and you talked, I think Jared or Jeff, one of those guys, talked about, the cloud first concept of deploying new functionality in SharePoint into the cloud. And what that does is it makes sure that when they release a version, like they drop a build so that you can do an on-premises SharePoint installation, you actually have the latest functionality all the time, so they're staying in sync. And I would say that's probably about 95% right now. There are a few things, for example, that you can do on-premise that you can't do in the cloud. A bunch, actually. And the other thing that was a goal for 2013 is if you make the whole experience better, like drag and drop, right? I don't have to go and say file, upload, browse, do all these things. I can literally just drag and drop into the browser. Then you actually get better adoption and you get better information, which leads to better records management through the life cycle of the document. All right, so site retention, let's talk about that for a second, and I'll demo this in a minute. But the idea is that I can actually define policies like let's delete a site automatically, or let's close and delete a site automatically after a certain amount of time, or let's let the project manager close the site, but then the site will get deleted in a year. So it'll be almost an archive of the site, for example. Right? So it's a compliance feature that applies to sites as a single container, as opposed to having to do it at the document level if you want. And the idea is that you can create and manage policies that apply to sites. So you can actually define three things: the retention policy for the site, what causes the project to be closed, so is it an external action, like a time event or something like that, or is it actually a human being going in there and closing the site down? And then after a project is closed, the project can expire, which means the site goes away, right? So let me actually just show that instead of talking about it. All right, so this is SharePoint 2013 hosted in the cloud on Office 365. So what I'm going to do right now is just show you that the way you set this up, if you want to use that feature, is I just went into site settings. If I go up to Site Collection Administration, there's actually a feature I need to enable that's not necessarily always enabled in a site collection, right? So if I go into Site Collection Features, you'll actually notice down here there's something called Site Policy. You have to actually enable that feature. So I've actually already activated it a minute ago. And when you turn that feature on, what happens is a new menu shows up. Actually, a couple new menus. One is called Site Policies, okay? And one is called Site Closure and Deletion. So Site Policies is actually the list of policies you're maintaining for the site collection. Kind of like quota templates and other things that you then apply somewhere else. And then Site Closure and Deletion defines this particular site, what are we doing on it? So meaning, what site policy are we using, right? And notice, because I don't have any site policies, I can't actually do anything. I can't close this site or anything. So let's actually go create a site policy right now. And I can create one. Let's create two, for example. One could be, our manual policy. And what does that mean? It means we're going to expect some sites that we're not going to do anything automatically, but we are going to make the site read-only when somebody closes it. So what that means is we're going to instruct sites of this type, the project manager of that site, when they're done, should go in and click a button that says, hey, I want to close this site. And what will happen is it'll stop showing up in Outlook, which is another integration feature if you're using site mailboxes, for example. It'll make the site read-only if I check this box down here, which is nice because now I have an archived copy of this site. But nobody can go in there and muck with that information, which is nice, right, from a snapshot in time perspective. But then I can also do things like, I want to make this more automatic. So I could say my 1-year policy says that I'm going to delete and close sites automatically and say, I want to close the site, after a year, let's say. Okay, because I know that this is a, 3-week project, but I want to make sure that things automatically closed out. But what I'll do is, let me send a notification to owners 3 months in advance to make sure if they're still using it, they can opt out and say, I still need to keep this site for a long time. Right? I could send follow-up notifications, and again, I'll mark it read-only when it's closed, because that's actually a really helpful feature. So now that I have some policies, I can actually go into my site closure settings, and I can say, this site will have the manual policy. course, I'm not supposed to get cancel, am I? And what will happen is now there's a policy applied to the site. And notice, because it's not the automatic one. By the way, anybody know why I picked the manual one over the automatic one? Because we didn't have a year to wait. Just hope you noticed that. I wasn't going to pick the other one and make us wait. So what I can do is, if I'm the manager now, I can actually go in here and notice this button is actually enabled. So I can now control the site. And notice what happened when anybody notice what happened when I closed the site? I have this lovely pink banner at the top now, which says this site is read-only at the site collection admin's request. What just happened is, because I closed the site, it's in this other state, which is I can browse everything and download documents and use everything, but it's locked in time. So it's basically a snapshot of this site where I can't touch it anymore. Now I can, as a site collection admin, actually go back and open this site up. But again, you want to lock down those permissions so people aren't opening up old sites, right? You want to lock those down. But then this now has a retention policy where this can actually get deleted in 7 years, let's say, the whole site as one, right? Which is a really handy feature instead of just managing information. And why this is really good is, let's say you use this in the combination with a record center. Let's say I'm collaborating with this guy right here in the front row. Yeah, you. And we're in HR, and we're making the new HR handbook, the manual that everybody gets. And we probably are using 20 or 30 documents because we've got this image, we've got some reference material, we've got whatever, got a couple drafts. And boom, we finally have our final HR handbook. And for some reason, we decided an HR handbook is a record as far as the company goes that we're going to maintain, because that's what people sign off on when they get hired, and so we need that. We could actually send that handbook to the record center. So now we have a copy of it that's going to be locked down. But then the site that we were working on, we don't really need that junk anymore, right? We were collaborating on it, but we don't necessarily want it to go away. So we could close the site, it'll be read-only, and then it'll expire after, let's say, 2, 3, 5, 7 years, whatever we decide, so that if we ever need to go back to show why we picked up a certain policy or something in the handbook, we have that information there. So it's nice to work in combination there. So let's make this unread-only, because I have other demos to do, but normally you wouldn't necessarily do that, right? So I'm going to open that back up, and my read-only bar goes away. So that was sort of the short version of this really powerful new feature called site retention. We've also got another feature called site mailboxes. And what site mailboxes do is it gives me the opportunity to manage email as a content type associated with a SharePoint project, let's say. And the idea is that it's really powerful from a records management perspective, because now I can actually associate all the email with a project and all the content, like documents, and actually apply consistent records management policies and retention policies to both sets of information. And if I want to do discovery or search, SharePoint now offers one consolidated search that'll actually let me search the Exchange mailboxes that the project emails are in and the SharePoint content. So I actually get them all rolled up into one place. So it's pretty easy to add an associated mailbox for a site, even existing ones. So let's say you were on SharePoint 2007 or 2010 and you upgrade to 2013. You can then, as long as you're running your site in 2013 mode, you can then add a site mailbox to an existing site. So even if the project was going on already, you can actually go in and add the site mailbox app, and I'll show you that in a second, and then start using it. You can also do things like drag emails from Outlook right into a document library if you want email to go into SharePoint. Some people like that. Some people want the email to stay in the mailbox because sort of mails work better in Exchange mailboxes, because you can send an email right to the mailbox. So anybody ever use the email in feature in SharePoint, which didn't really work much at all, right? Because it sort of worked about 80% of the time, which is really a good, reliable number when you want users to do something consistently, right? You probably want to start thinking about site mailboxes instead now, because now you have a really much more reliable way to email something in, and then you can have users, drag and drop attachments right into SharePoint if they want. They can leave them in Exchange, etc., depending on what, how you're going to approach that project. You can also manage emails as records. You can close and expire sites and mailboxes together, which I mentioned. So let me just show you how you'd actually create one of these if you haven't seen this already. So if I go into SharePoint, let me actually just go into the sites. There's my mouse right there. So if I click Sites up here, this is actually the sites I'm following, which is a new feature in SharePoint. And let's just create a new site. And let's call this the Project Cake. And I don't think this should take too long. Good question. So I'm using the default site template associated with that new site button, which right now happens to be this one. Right? But you can associate what template is associated with that button right there. Right? But good point. The site template I'm using doesn't actually have the Mailbox app enabled. I did that on purpose so I could show you how to enable it. So if you use the default site template, which is out of the box, there's this button over here which you can click. And what that does is it brings you to the Site Mailbox app. Now, is everybody familiar with the app model in SharePoint? And what I mean by that, I think it's important to point out because users, oh, come on, you're going to do that to me. Where was I? I was right here. And then I'll go back here. Let me do this again. So there's Project Cake, right? That's the one I created. I'm going to go back in there. Before I actually add the Mailbox app, if I want to add as a user a new list, right? I actually don't add a document library per se. What I add is an app. And one of those apps happens to be called Document Library. So it's a little bit different metaphor for users to get familiar with. But one of the apps you can add is right over here called Site Mailbox. So I'm going to create a Site Mailbox. And notice I have a Site Mailbox. Guess what that did? Not much yet. One more step. I have to actually click that, and it's going to provision me now a Site Mailbox in Exchange. So it's actually, SharePoint is now talking to Exchange, and it's saying, hey, Exchange, could you create me a Site Mailbox called Project Cake? And it will be projectcake@jornada.com will be the name of the email that I could actually email in if I want. I can also drag and drop all that stuff. So right now, SharePoint and Exchange are talking to each other to actually set up my mailbox. And once that's set up, and yes, I'm brave for doing this all live, and I don't care. So, let's see. All right, so there it is. So I'm going to go back to SharePoint, and notice what I actually get now is I get this mailbox link over here, and if I click that, it'll actually take me to my mailbox. Now, I'm doing everything in the browser, but I could actually connect Outlook to SharePoint, just like I could in the past, where it's going to keep copies of my document offline local for me, but I can also connect it to Exchange, and they're actually synced together. So almost think of it as like a really much better version of like what public folders used to be, but now it's associated with SharePoint so that I can actually do all these things. Since it's the first time I'm logging into this particular mailbox, it's just asking me what time zone I'm in, just because it's the first time. But the idea now is that I have a mailbox now called Project Cake that I can associate. So the site and the mailbox are all connected. And I can apply the same policies to both, et cetera. Right? So let me go back to my site. And we'll go from there. So because I want to cover a lot of things, I'm not going to go super, super deep. What I want to make sure you do is get an understanding of how all these things could help you. And we're not even into the best practices part yet, but hopefully this is useful so you can see what you could use. All right. The other thing I mentioned was feature parity, which, again, isn't really a new feature per se, but the idea is that my records center and all that other stuff I can do in the cloud now, right, that I couldn't do before. But I still have a limitation in the cloud, which is, frankly, Microsoft's record management implementation is probably maybe 60 or 70% of the way there. What I mean by that is that, DoD certification and things like that aren't actually, it's not a certified application unless you add on more things, right? But if you don't need that level of certification, it could be exactly what you need. But you have to be careful then, because now you might need to go to third parties and things like that, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But if you want to do basic records management functionality, and you have some minor tweaks that you want to do, let's say, you can do those in the cloud if you want to. How many people are actually thinking about moving to Office 365 in general, or already there? Okay, so most of the crowd actually is thinking about staying on premise. So again, want to mention it for future reference so that you understand the difference. So cloud parity, again, this could be a really quick demo, I guess, but the idea is that I'm in the cloud right now. I can actually go to, for example, let's go to my my home page here. And I can go to, for example, my record center. And so I have all the templates that I'm used to, and I can do in place and all that stuff right from the cloud-based. But the nice thing is you have that feature parity, so you can actually choose which you want to do, which one. Okay. The other thing that's new in 2013, which again I'm not going to really go into because you should go to a dedicated e-discovery session or do the e-discovery hands-on lab, and the nice thing is you can watch all the sessions even if you miss them, is there is an e-discovery center, which is a new site template essentially in SharePoint 2013. And what it allows you to do is view and manage in-place holds for both SharePoint and Exchange together, do query-based preservation to say, I want to hold this classification of document based on this query, right? And then allow you to export a set of files, for example, to the legal team or whoever. I won't go into e-discovery that much, but I want to make sure you understand that that's a new feature as well. And that's probably a different but related topic, like I mentioned. All right, so let's get into the best practices. Before I do that, I will give a copy of both of these books away. So, has anybody ever seen the green book before? Okay, cool. So you guys don't get one, right, because you already have one. I have a copy here with me somewhere, and hopefully I'll get it by the end of the session. I forgot. It's at the booth, so I forgot to get it, but I'm going to give a copy away. And then 2013, Sue Hanley and I, everybody know Sue Hanley? Anybody know Sue? Oh, there she is right in the front row. Hi, Sue. So Sue and I have this ongoing debate. It's not really a debate. We're just joking around, but I like the teal, and she likes the purple. So I put the teal color up on the book, on my slide, and she put the purple one. And it's anyone's guess what the real color will be when it comes out early next year. So, Sue just said it'll be purple. And Sue usually wins, so it's probably going to be purple. So, all right, so to give away a book, don't shout out the answer. Raise your hand if you know it. What is the magazine that features Goofus and Gallant? Anybody raise your hand? Right here. No. Sue, you have the book. Right here. Highlights, yes. Very good. So you win the copy of the book. Come see me at the end and you get a book. Thanks. Good job, by the way. So that's a great question because only like 3 people in the whole audience know it. But then they go, oh, right, yes. I read that when I was 6. Okay. Records management challenges. So we already talked about these, but I want to mention these because hopefully my top 10 list starts to address some of them, right, a little bit. So we talked about things like applying retention, end-user management, adoption, all that stuff. So let's go into the actual list. So the first thing you really need to do is identify who's in charge of what within your organization, and frankly, what does records management even mean within your organization? So you want to go talk to certain people, if you haven't already, right? You've got records managers and compliance officers. So you got to figure out, do we even have a records manager in our organization? And if there isn't one, there should be one. And it's probably, starts off with someone in the legal team working with compliance, if they're 2 different groups or if they're all on one team, for example, defining what it means to do things like retention within your organization, define what we mean when we use the words records management in your organization, and identify who those people are, because really, at the end of the day, you want to turn the solution over to them to manage, right? IT will still have to manage the back end, but really the business and the compliance officers and records managers should really own what's going on. You also want to identify on the IT team who's doing what there, right? Who's going to implement whatever processes and helpful stuff that you put in place for records management. Another constituency is content managers. So who's actually creating the content that will end up becoming a record? And are those people adequately trained to know what they're supposed to do with content in SharePoint in order to manage records effectively? And they probably have teams of people or associates or whatever, so do we need to train them to train other people, et cetera? So you want to think about that. And then users in general, right? We want general users, if we're going to do real records management at some point, and we're not just going to very selectively pick off a record here and there, and then just go to town on making sure it looks good. If we want that to be more and more of a standard process, because that's what we're seeing, is that records management used to be, hey, we have these very specific record types that we need to manage, so we can actually focus on those and have a completely separate process. But what we're seeing now is there's this whole like ECM for the masses concept where every information worker, to use a terrible term, right, needs to understand in a larger sense what's going to happen to this piece of content over time. So those users who work with the content every day, both from a creation and a consumption perspective, need to make sure they're using the system effectively. The other thing you need to do, number 2, is take a look at your organizational content and work again with somebody, not probably in IT, frankly, to figure out what should actually become records within the organization. And maybe some of this is defined, and maybe it's not, but you definitely have to define this first before you go anywhere near SharePoint, right? So one of the things I like to do with SharePoint is I tell people, here's what you do with SharePoint. You leave it in the box, right? You step away from the keyboard, and you go have lots of discussions in the organization around how it's going to be used. Because otherwise, without that direction over time, you're going to wish you did that later. All right, quality metadata. So this is actually one of my favorite topics in SharePoint, which is how do you actually encourage quality metadata, right? How do you make sure that if you need to do things like, from a records perspective, use metadata, like what type of document it is, and what client was this document work done for? And, is this part of a bigger project that has to do with some kind of compliance-related, is this regulated, what I'm doing, right? Because depending on the content type, depending on the type of document, I might need to do some kind of records management, but also depending on who's touching it, depending on what kind of project I'm doing, whether it's regulated, right, or not. There's lots of different reasons. So you have to make sure users know that, but you have to make sure that that information, if it comes from somewhere else before it becomes a record, is quality. So you want to do a couple things. Number one, you want to make sure you're treating your contributors differently from your consumers. And what that means is the people actually creating the documents or adding metadata properties and things like that, they're going to have a different point of view than your consumers. The consumers want to just find things and use them effectively, right? But the people that are contributing need to be encouraged and motivated and trained to actually put the right information on top of that document. I also believe in columns and not folders, except when you should create folders, right? So what does that mean? How many people allow folders within SharePoint? Okay. How many do it exclusively for one of these three reasons? Number one, to scale through partitioning a document library. Number two, to apply permissions more effectively. Or number three, to use location-based default metadata properties. Anybody use it for other reasons? Yeah, all you guys? Okay, those are the best. In fact, I would say those are the only three reasons to use them. I don't like using them for any other reason but those three. So basically, when I say create columns, not folders, wow, I get applause. Wow. It was one guy, but hey, I'll take it, So, say what? One more time? What did he say? I didn't hear it. I still can't hear him. What did he say? Oh, the keynote speaker had folders. Yeah, he's crazy. What is he thinking? What? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't hear you from here because the speakers go that way. So, yeah, the keynote had folders in it. What is that craziness, right? So, do not do folders. And Sue, I don't know, maybe you have one more to add to this list, but I have three reasons why you have folders, and those are the only three. Anything else, you want to find another solution, right? So folders aren't completely evil, but you just have to use them creatively. Just like a lot of things, you want to use them well. So those are the three reasons, and I'm actually going to show you one of them, which is the default metadata value, which is actually, I think, a really powerful feature, and I'll show you why in a second. You'll also want to train users on the perils of the title property. So has anybody seen the demo that I did on Monday, but I'll do it again if you want, where you do a search and you get results that you think are wrong, but actually they are the best possible results, and it's because the users did a really bad job at managing titles, which they didn't even know they had to do, which is kind of crazy that SharePoint hasn't fixed this problem in 2013, because it's still not really fixed, frankly. All right, so let's go in and I'll show you why that SharePoint is still a challenge sometimes. SharePoint's great. I love SharePoint. Don't get me wrong. All right, so let's go into, I don't know, let's go into here. Okay, so how many folders do you see? None. Right. What kind of document content metadata is there? There's client, there's project, there's the project type, there's the title. We've got all kinds of good stuff. So I can do things like, sort by client or filter by client. I only want to see Contoso stuff. It's great. I can go over here and say, I only want to see product development or a contract or, what kind of project it is. I can go back and, it's great, right? Metadata is an awesome thing for that reason. I can also do manage metadata navigation on the left. There's all kinds of things I do. I don't want to go into the deep dive on ECM here. The reason this is important to records management is that I might want to, again, based on the project type, based on the client, based on the content type of the document, do different things with it because they could automatically become records depending on what I want to do. So for me, this is really important. Now notice I have this other view called contributor. That actually exposes this document library for what it really is, which is a document library with a bunch of folders in it. And the reason is my default view is a folderless view. So if you go in and uncheck the box, or check the box, whatever you do, that says, or actually it's a radio button, now that I remember it. It says, do I want folders shown or do I not? Right, so the default view is I do not. I do not want anybody to know or care that there's folders. Right? From a consumption perspective, it's much easier to do navigation and filtering through metadata properties. But the reason I have a contributor view is that I can do the following, which is, let's do this. Let's say I'm working on the Tailspin Toys merger. I can drill into the Tailspin Toys merger folder, and I could do things like, here's the Tailspin Toys merger contract. I can drag and drop that right in there. And because I'm using contextual default properties set up for this library, notice that it filled out all my metadata for me. It knows it's a project type of, whoa. So don't use folders unless you need folders. Now this isn't, so you know what this is? This is really training wheels, right? For users, when they upload documents, instead of prompting them for all these metadata properties, which you're always not going to be able to get all of them through this method, but at least this gives you a head start, and it can actually encourage users to see the value in metadata properties because now they can start using that information, okay? So that's one of the things I want you to do. One of the things I want you to notice, though, is if I go back to, let's actually go back to here, let's say. This is my site that this stuff is in. So let's say I do a search, and I want the Tailspin Toys, Tailspin, thank you, Toys merger. Okay. All right, search is all fixed because FAST is integrated, right? Yes. All right, so wait a minute. So I wanted the Tailspin Toys merger document, and I got Death Star plans. Anybody know why this happened? Right, it's because the document that I dragged and dropped from my desktop was from my last job when I worked for Darth Vader, right? And part of the document that I liked that I used in my last job, I just made a copy of that, and I just rejiggered some stuff, and then I dragged and dropped that into SharePoint. The nice thing is it got all the right metadata because I used the folder-based, location-based metadata navigation, I don't know, whatever that thing's called, the default metadata properties. But what it didn't fix for me is that SharePoint automatically took the title property and upgraded it into the title property into SharePoint. And guess what SharePoint 2013 still does? It still uses the title property as the thing it shows you in search results. Okay, so this is really confusing for users. You know why? This is exactly the right document. Search is working perfectly. But because I have some terrible information in my document, right, I have terrible metadata, the title property is actually wrong because me as a user made it wrong, then that's what's going to show up. So notice, Tailspin Toys proposed merger, that looks good. If I do the hover and I look at the document, it probably says the right stuff, right? But I'm still going to be confused and I'm still going to think search is awful. Okay, so why does this matter for records management? Again, you want to make sure you have quality information because if I do an e-discovery on this later and we're looking for merger docs and Tailspin Toys, people will gloss right over the fact that even though they came up in the document, they might just look and go, oh, that's not relevant because it's, you know, the Death Star plans or whatever. So how do you fix this? Well, training users is probably the most effective way. And showing them, do this demo. Like, call me on the phone, and we'll get on a link live meeting, whatever, and we'll do the demo and say, here's why you want to do this. Now notice, I don't know if you noticed this, but when I dragged and dropped, it actually says Tommy's science project for that contract that I just did. So, mommy lawyer woman grabbed a document off her home PC and converted that to the contract and then uploaded it, and now it still has the old title, which is Tommy's Science Project on it. So we have the same problem there. So what do we do there? Well, again, we want to encourage users, potentially, to understand the value of that property. And it's you know, there's two things you can do. There's actually three. Number one, right? Train users that that title property is there. Number 2, change your search results page to use the file name instead of the title property, which is kind of a hack because now you're just pretending the problem doesn't exist and you're just showing people different things in search. The third thing that I sometimes do is I'll run a PowerShell script that literally takes every file name and shoves it in the title property. Now, the problem with that is that if you have users that are really good and they put good titles in there, you just crush their hopes and dreams, right? Exactly. So you want to go talk to your users and figure out what the right approach is for your organization. And believe it or not, more often than not, it's just shove the file name into the title property, which is my least favorite one, but it's actually really effective when you just need to get down and dirty and make it happen. But I just wanted to point out that even though this incredible engine called FAST is merged, and SharePoint's awesome, and it's 2013, and da-da-da-da-da, you still have this problem. So, question? Yes, you can. You can actually do a few things. You can show the title and have it grab the title, the actual title of the document, which is one of the things you can do. And the other thing I like to do is actually display the title property in the actual view so that people can see if it's wrong or not. And the nice thing now that you can do things like edit the files right in the what's that called, the grid there, the grid. And you can actually do manage metadata properties, which you couldn't do in 2010. So you can do things like edit your metadata, and you can change the title property sort of all at the same time. So just something to point out there that's still sort of potentially a problem. Okay. That was number 3. That was the most fun one yet, right? Number 3? I like number 3. By the way, what time do we go till? 10:15? Ah, crap, I'm on number 4. Okay, no, the rest of them will go quickly, actually. So a file plan. So what's a file plan? It's a planning document that you're probably not going to do. It's actually something the organization will do, but you need to know what one is and you need to manage it, right? So what it looks like is you want to say, here's the type of record we have, here's a description of it, right? How long are we retaining this? And that's typically, usually you don't actually call out retention. Specifically, what you do is you bucket it into, this is the classification. It's an employee benefit plan versus a payroll record. And then you define the retention at that level. So I've actually worked with recently a company that they took all their different policies, because they defined like literally 500 or so different content types, and they boiled them down to 4 buckets, right? 2 years, 7 years, 12 years, and 99 years, and that was it. And the legal department actually decided that. And what's interesting is there's no real standard for this. Every organization defines their own standard. It just needs to be defined. That's the key. So file plans. So I can actually go in, and once I've actually set up, let's say you didn't do that homework. I can actually go in, though, and create a file plan report. So I can actually go into, for example, let's say I actually put some compliance policies right here. I can actually go into the library settings and spit out a file plan report. So let's say I've done a bunch of work to set all this stuff up and I never actually documented this. It's actually really nice when an auditor comes in or something like that to be able to say, hey, can you show me what your compliance policies are? And instead of having to go, oh crap, we never wrote that down, right? You can actually spit a report out of SharePoint by going to the file plan link. And I don't think this should take very long. Sorry, same joke twice. But it actually spit out a spreadsheet that we can use and look at. This really won't take very long, I swear. Okay, there it is. So I can go in here. It's an Excel report. I'm going to open up Excel Web Access and take a look at that. And you can see that, there's 9 folders, which is good to know, right? And there's 9 folders because I'm actually using the default location stuff to set my properties. Retentions are based on content types, right? It shows me my content types here. I don't have many defined in this particular one. I can go into retention details, which is, right now the schedule is after it's declared a record, we'll kind of keep it for 7 years and then move it to the recycle bin, which seems weird. We should probably permanently delete that. We could always fix that. And then there's folder details. Hey, what are the folders? Right? How many items in there? Do they have unique permission, et cetera, et cetera? You get the idea. But the idea is that it's a nice way to come back and actually create a file plan, which you probably need, again, to show the compliance officer, hey, we're actually really doing this stuff. You also want to develop retention schedules. I mentioned the whole 2, 99-year, et cetera bucket. You want to figure out when it's no longer active, how long it should be retained, what should happen to it. Does it get archived, deleted, et cetera? Right? Retention schedules are pretty easy to set up. Basically, they work just like they did in SharePoint 2010, where if I go into Let's actually go into this document library. And let me just show you, because you can do this anywhere, whether I have a record center or it's just a regular document library. I go into the library settings, and it's under information management policy settings, right? So I can actually define retention in 3 ways. I can actually change the source and say, I want this based on library and folders. So do I want, the difference here is, do I want my retention schedule based on a specific type of content, or do I want it based on a bucket? So the stuff I throw in this folder is retained a certain way, or the stuff I throw in this library is retained a certain way, versus no matter where I put it, I want all contracts to be retained this way. So that's the difference there. Okay. Number 6, design your solution. Well, that sounds obvious, right? Well, what that means is, what elements do you need? And this is where, companies like mine, for example, go out and help our customers figure out, what do you really need to enable? What don't you need? What's going to be overkill? What's going to solve your business problem? So there's all kinds of features that I already mentioned that I won't go into. But the idea is, the main decision you probably have is the in-place versus record center. So in-place is, I'm in a document library collaborating. I can say, manage this thing in place as a record, or I can move it to a record center, right? And if I move it to a record center, I start needing to ask myself some questions, like, wait a minute, okay, so let's say hypothetically I don't use a record center and I use my just in place. Well, then I have to ask myself, is the governance of the collaboration site appropriate for managing records? Because if it is, I probably shouldn't leave it there. I should probably move it, right? Is my industry that I work for subject to some kind of requirement about physically separating this content? Like, it has to be in a separate database, let's say, or a separate web app, or separate physical machine, right? Then, again, that's going to dictate whether I'm in place or in a record center. Do I trust the power user who's doing site collection or site administration to maintain these records properly? Because they can go in and undeclare records and do things like that. Do I really want that to happen, or do I need to lock it down more? Right? Do I trust that user, or not even trust, but is that person the appropriate person? And then the other thing is, if I have a site that's different from the collaboration site, it's probably appropriate then to have different permissions. The only problem with that is, if I have different permissions, then I have to think about, okay, well, is this collaboration site going to be around for a while? And if I need to keep records longer than the project, maybe again I want to put those records somewhere else so that I can do that cool thing where I shut down the site, like in our HR handbook example that we worked on, right? Where I can shut down the site, archive it, but then I'm keeping the actual record that I moved to a record center for 7 or 99 years or whatever it is. Well, the project members need access to the documents later. So now this is where the record center gets hard, because now if I've moved something to the record center but I still need it, even though I've declared it a record, now do I have to go to 2 places? Now I have to start using things like the content query web part to roll it up. But if it's in a different site collection, I can use a feature called the content search web part, which is a new feature in 2013 that allows me to use the search index to go across site collections to roll that stuff up. By the way, I always go this fast, so sorry I'm going so fast, but I like a quick pace. You like it? Oh, what? Yes, you can leave a link, exactly, to go back to it. But it's still a 2-step process, right? I have to go there and then go back. But you're right, I can leave a link there. I like that. All right, so let's talk about other factors. So, are records manager responsible for everything, right? That's another consideration. Do I have a records center? Because it's easier for a records manager if they just have one place to go, for example. So what I did is, I don't want to go through all these because we sort of talked through the issues, but I put a chart in here which is sort of the, here's the factors in deciding this. So you have factors like who manages records, do I maintain all the versions, do I want to keep my collaboration site tidy, do I want it to be cluttered, who needs to have certain security, and this is basically a pros and cons list for, do I use Records Archive, which is the record center, or do I use In Place? Right? There's other factors too, like who administers things. It's easier for collaborators if you do it in place. It's easier for the records manager to do it in the record center, for example. So the difference, basically, if you haven't seen the functionality, again, it's the same as it was in 2010, which is if I go into, for example, my documents here. Let's actually go to a different place. Let's go into this guy. All right, cool. So notice there's little locks on some of these. That basically means that I've declared it as a record. So it's locked down, and I've done this in place. So I can actually click on, let's say, this guy, And up in the ribbon, which doesn't show up by default, I can go in here and say, declare this guy as a record. And what will happen is it'll lock that guy down. Now it's set as a record. And potentially things like retention schedules and other things kick in, right? The other thing I could do is go over here and say, you know what? I don't want to do that. I want to go here and do a send to my record center. So I can go over here and say, I want to move this guy over to my record center. And what I can do there then is actually move it to my record center and, to your point, leave a link there, right? Or make a copy. There's different ways you can actually configure what's called send to locations, right? And the send to location is I could either put it into a SharePoint record center or maybe even put it outside of SharePoint if I want, depending if it's a different thing. So then if I actually go to my record center, you'll notice that that brand new document should be right there, and there it is right there. It's the marketing data and forecast. It's one of these. And then I could actually have, for example, a content organizer partition this information, apply different metadata. Again, you can actually use that default metadata trick in multiple places. So at each stage of the document lifecycle, you can actually have it pick up more and more interesting metadata information so that you can actually do better things on it as the lifecycle of the document progresses. HTML pages, that's a good one. The nice thing is because they're just items in SharePoint, you can treat them just like documents. So you can actually declare those as records and move them to the record center as well. It's not any different in 2013. You can, but you can't do it exactly out of the box. I agree with you. It doesn't work exactly like documents do. But I can come to that after if you want to talk through it. Yeah. You also want to plan how content will become records. So basically, it's real simple. Do we have people manually declare things like I just did, or you define a policy that actually sends it? So if you noticed before, in the policies, I can actually say after a certain amount of time, for example, a document can become a record. You could have a workflow created, right? Or you can use a custom solution. So you can actually have custom code move things around. You also want to think about when you figure out how content becomes a record. Is it enforced compliance or voluntary? Meaning, do you want to tell users, hey, you should do this? Or do you say, listen, we're going to get sued by the government if we don't do this, so it's a requirement, and it's going to affect your performance review at the end of the year. And that's one of the things that you need to figure out is really the enforced stuff goes under your governance policy, and the voluntary stuff goes under more guidelines and training and things like that, right? At least in my view. Again, can you depend on the cooperation of users in your organization? That's a weighty question, but it's a factor. So all this stuff we're talking about depends on whether you're having a conversation with your users and your organization is bought in to doing this appropriately. So is it an idle desire, right? So when you go talk to people in your organization that say, we need records management, right? You want to decipher whether that's an idle desire or whether they're serious about it, which means users have to get serious about it. Okay, are you going to store things in SharePoint or not? Are you going to maintain physical content? These are just other questions to ask, right? So this is an example of, again, how something becomes a record. We send it to a physical vault, we have a user manually do it, et cetera. Things to think about. You also want to plan email integration. So I mentioned before that's a new feature of 2013. Does email and SharePoint stuff, should they get retained together or not, right? I won't demo it again because you already saw it, but that's something you might want to use a site mailbox for. Compliance reporting, I showed you how to create a file plan, kick that right out of SharePoint. That's a very important thing. You can also kick out audit reports out of SharePoint. Again, not really different than they were in 2010, so you can compile audit information, but you can't really report on it that well. Just letting you know what's there and what's not there. The other thing is third-party add-ons. We do something for our clients which is very lightweight for what they want to do, which is setting up default properties and things automatically through a wizard and automatically through a CRM integration and things like that. But there are other vendors like Gimel who has full DoD 5015 compliance that bolts onto SharePoint. So again, you want to make the decision, do you need full-blown records management, or how does your organization define what you need? Is it just retention? Is it retention based on events versus time? Little subtle things like that will actually make a determination whether you have to go. And Gimel actually has a really nice little brochure which shows you where SharePoint sort of ends and where there's lapses. High Software, also at the conference, also has some things like folder-based security and folder-based metadata-based security, excuse me, things like that that again could help in your quest. All right, so what's the key difference here? I showed you a bunch of features. I just want to give you the rundown on where you can use them. So location-based metadata, which is the default properties. The good thing is that works everywhere. If you're on 2007, you're out of luck. This is a 2010 forward feature, and it works on-premise and in the cloud. The Record Center works everywhere except for SharePoint Online, the 2010 version. The content search web part I mentioned, which you can aggregate content, that's only a 2013 feature. Site retention is a 2013 feature. Site mailbox is a 2013 feature. And the ability to do full trust third-party solutions like the Gimmels and High Softwares of the world, those only work on-premise. But it sounds like this crowd mostly is doing on-premise. But if you're thinking about cloud going forward, it might be a consideration. So, for example, you might do in-the-cloud collaboration, but then on-premise records management, right, because of that need. All right, so we're basically about to wrap up. We've got my 7 things to take away. What do you really need? Do you need full records management? Do you need something else, right? Identify those roles and get buy-in, right? Are you pretending to do records management, or are you actually doing it? Encourage great content management through simple policies. So teach people 2 things. Either fill out the metadata or create default values so you can drag and drop, that's 1. And number 2, don't forget about the title property, which will kill your search results, even with super duper mega fast integration in 2013. Do you need in-place or record center or a little of both? That's something you should determine. Do you want on-premise or cloud? Do you need a third party? And make sure you do planning, right? So don't use the classic SharePoint approach of ready, fire, aim, right? Make sure you do some planning here. Make sure you get buy-in, identify the right people, and then if you need help, you can call me and I'll talk you through it. Yell at the constituents and users, and I love doing all that. All right, so recap. So we went through ECM features, why that's important in the context of records management. We went through what is records management, what's new in 2013, and really, probably, when I say top 10, it's probably 10 of 100. But these are things that I've seen that really you need to think about before you jump in. Here's some resources that are in the slide deck. I'll let you look at them. There's also some related sessions. There's actually an e-discovery instructor-led hands-on lab at noon or so, which might be good. And by the way, we forgot about Bob. What happened to Bob? What about Bob? Bob's actually happy. You know why? He came to the session. He gave me good scores, which is good. I like Bob for that. And then his users were happy because he talked to them and he gave them the right solution at the end of the day. Right? And he got a raise, too, by the way. So that's... So if you have questions, feel free to come to the mic, but thank you so much for coming.
Scott, thank you so much. Scott. You are the first guy that I've heard here at this entire conference who really seems to understand enterprise content management and records management, so thank you for that. You're kind of a kindred spirit. That's good.
Thank you.
I have a million questions. I'll ask this one. The one thing that SharePoint doesn't do well that other traditional ECM systems do well is permanent links to objects. There is a doc ID. It kind of sucks.
It still sucks.
Is that something you think is ever going to be on Microsoft's radar to fix?
You know, I can't speak for them, but I don't know. I've given that feedback back that that's something that's important, but because SharePoint's so site collection based, it's not really changing because Microsoft actually even went more site collection based in this release only because from a cloud perspective, your tenant is essentially sort of this site collection is what you're managing. So it's sort of just an approach that, it's great feedback and I'll take it to the product team because I talk to them all the time and I don't know what they'll tell me, but Thank you. Thanks for coming. By the way, sorry, make sure you fill out your eval. I'm supposed to say that, right? Go to SPC and fill out your eval.
Do you have a best practice on the?
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, over here. Do you have a best practice on this scale problem where you define your retention logic on a per library basis, and in place you go into library settings and you get it. You're all set. That's great for one library. Now I have 2 or 3 libraries per site, 200 or 300 sites.
So one of the things that, because of the site collection limitation and the library limitation, we've actually developed in-house tools that SharePoint hasn't shipped with yet.
Yeah, I wrote something in PowerShell
basically that's the
sucks
only
it all
thing we've
out
come
and
up
pumps
with
in.
is instead of manually going into a million places for things like default metadata and for retention policies and things like that, if you want to use them in a way that you're going to have to repeat yourself, we've actually written things that you just literally fill out a couple things and it goes and does it for you, right? And that's that lightweight stuff I was talking about, so that if you don't need 50/50 in compliance, maybe you just need that tool set.
Is it like a tool, or is it like, were you able to bake it into your site or your library template?
No, it's actually a tool that actually
I'm fine then.
changes things. And the other option, by the way, that we've done, which is more of a professional services thing to your point, is we've actually baked that into the template. Because you're right, if you want to actually add retention to a site, you can't actually put that in the site template unless you write like a feature
I just want
stapler.
every library that they create to have these
We've had to
rules,
do that
and
with
I
a
don't want to
feature
have
stapler.
to know they created it
Yeah.
and then run my tool on it. I want it
Yeah,
just to come with a template.
it's still not an out-of-the-box thing, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If you get records under control,
I'm sorry?
if you get records under control, the stuff that you need to keep, but you're not controlling everything else,
Right.
then it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory. So it was implicit but never stated. You really need to have expiration that's
Yeah.
probably shorter than the records retention
That's right.
for any non-record content, and you're really looking at managing sites and regular content in that context.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Good point. Any questions right here? Hey.
Could you explain the concept of location-based metadata again?
Okay, so location-based metadata, here's what it is in a nutshell. I can go into a library and say, anything I put in this library will have all this metadata without me having to do anything else. So let's say in that library, I've got 10 columns, either through content types or not, right? And if I don't set up location-based metadata, if I upload a document, I'm prompted as a user and I have to fill all that stuff out. If I do set location-based metadata, which is just in library settings, then if I drag and drop or upload or whatever a document in there, it'll automatically apply all that metadata for me. But then you're like, well, what if I want different metadata depending on a folder? I have a Contoso folder and a Litware folder. I want the client name to be different. Well, then I can set default metadata at the library level and then override it at the folder level. And then if I drag it into that folder, it'll actually get different metadata. And the idea is that it prevents users from having to explicitly put things in if I know that if I just drop it into this folder, I'm good to go. And then you create a different view for consumers that ignore those folders.
Okay, thank you. Great session.
Thank you very much. Fill out your eval.
A question?
It is. They're both available in 2010. That feature is in 2010. So it's the best feature you're not using. Yeah.
With in-place records management,
Yeah. What?
I'm over here.
Sorry, over there.
With in-place records management, if you have some of your users declare records out of the box, are you protected from that site being deleted?
That's a great question, and the answer is no.
Okay, that's what I thought.
So this is where SharePoint, sort of out of the box, can let you do stupid things, right? So what you need to do is you need to think about, well, how do I secure sites and have controls in place? Because people can still do stupid things, right? Like if I'm managing hard records and I put them in my Iron Mountain box and I put it in the back of my car and then it falls out and it falls in the river, like that wasn't the box's fault and it wasn't Iron Mountain's fault. It was me as a stupid user fault, right? So one of the things you need to do is figure out, what is SharePoint letting me do that's stupid, which you just mentioned, and then how can I approach that? Because SharePoint will let you do lots of stupid things, frankly. Especially when it comes to records, because at least records get locked down, but someone can go in and unlock the record if they have permissions, which is sort of antithetical to the whole point of what a record is, right?
Right.
So that's why you need to put other controls into place to prevent that from happening. But it's a really good point.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I actually have 3 questions, and my first
Three?
question was the same as his.
Yep.
But it was more with respect to the site policies
Yeah.
that are the new feature.
Yeah.
So if you have a site policy that says delete this site, but you have in-place records in that site, it'll still delete it?
Yes.
Okay.
Lucky you.
The second question is an easy one, probably. When you upload a document into a library by dragging and dropping,
Yep.
I didn't see any place where it prompts you for metadata.
That's because I didn't have any required metadata. If
So
I
it'll
did
only prompt you if you have required metadata?
Yeah.
But if you don't...
If you don't have required metadata, it won't prompt you. Even if you have required metadata, it won't prompt you. Well, not with drag and drop, but what you do then is to enforce that, you set check-in, check-out on, and it'll leave the document checked out.
Which
if you don't like
actually
check-in,
can be bad.
oh yeah, I
'Cause
know. This is another one of those things that SharePoint is giving you one thing and sort of taking something else away, right?
Yeah.
Which is, if you have required metadata, which is why you need to think through, do I use location-based metadata? Do I use required metadata? Do I use check-in, check-out?
Actually,
it's really good point.
It's actually why we use a third-party add-in for uploading documents.
Yeah.
But
But people love drag and drop is the problem, right?
I know. But we use an add-in for that. The last question is very specific. At our organization, we named our files a particular way. We didn't want to put spaces in the name of our files because we don't like having %20s in our URLs.
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't even go there, but I love that topic.
Okay. So we named them we might have put the year in the front, 2012, and then a name with no spaces.
Okay.
But now you go and look for that file with search, and if you search for a word that's in the middle of that name, it won't find it.
So we recommend using dashes and underscores.
Even then, it won't find it. It won't.
Yeah.
find
Well, no. It will. It'll use that as a word breaker and find
Will
it.
it?
Trust me, it does.
Okay. Well, that's good to
Hyphen
know.
and underscore both work.
Because we're camel naming, and it won't
Yeah.
find the word.
So if you squish it all together with no spaces, because spaces cause that %20 problem, then there's no word breaker to separate every keyword, right?
Okay.
So what you want to do is either do a dash or an underscore. And that works. And just pick one.
Thanks. I owe you a beer now.
And okay, so I think we're setting up for the next session. We might want to. Okay, there's two more questions.
Just real quick, as we continue to understand how to control ECM better in SharePoint, and we start some sort of ECM process in 2007, then we moved to 2010, subscribe to the Content Hub, add some sort of retention policies on that, and now it seems like we're, evolving and continuing to evolve. It's complicating the migration strategy. Is there some way to kind of get ahead of that, or?
Come to my session that I did on Monday. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't really talk about that much. But the idea is that in 2013, the good news, in some weird way, is that all the records management and ECM features, like the core ones, are really the same. So you shouldn't have a big upgrade or migration problem there.
Okay.
Just for now. So I say keep doing what you're doing. I think that, where it gets tricky is like custom code and things like that. So, and that's where you just need to be careful because that's the biggest upgrade challenge typically.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Yeah. Hey, guys.